You know, sometimes it really hits you just how different life was not that long ago.
Yeah.
I was looking at some figures about Goethe's family, the guy who wrote The Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Right.
And it's astonishing. In his own relatively privileged household in the late 1700s, only about 25% of his kids lived to adulthood.
Wow.
3 out of 12.
That's
Compare that to Germany in 2020, where the child survival rate past 15 is like around 99.5%.
What's fascinating there is how that incredible leap just underscores the power of shared information.
Right.
Think about Google's mission to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. In a way, they're operating on this principle that more widespread access to knowledge is like the best way to solve the kinds of problems that plagued Goethe's time. The dangers of ignorance and the inability to kind of effectively tackle these threats to survival.
Right.
And their underlying belief seems to be that with enough information, we can not only create more powerful tools, but we can also learn how to use them wisely.
Right. But then, as you pointed out, Goethe's story itself serves as a potent reminder that simply having more information at our fingertips doesn't automatically lead to better outcomes.
Right.
That's really the core of what we're kind of digging into today. We're not just looking at information as this neutral, objective thing that Google wants to organize.
Right.
We're going to kind of delve into your sources,
Right.
which offer this really compelling exploration of how information has functioned throughout history, from the earliest human societies right up to the age of AI.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what emerges is this really interesting idea that information's most fundamental role might not be to accurately represent reality.
Okay.
Instead, it's a primary function that seems to be connection, the way it forms networks and links disparate elements together. And this shift in perspective has some really profound implications. Especially as we grapple with the rise of sophisticated AI and this current wave of populism that we're seeing.
So our aim today is to really make you reconsider what it means to be informed. We're going to explore how this idea of information as connection, rather than just representation, has shaped human history and what it might mean for our future in this increasingly complex, information-rich world. Okay, so let's unpack this naive view of information that you mentioned. It sounds like Google's optimistic stance embodies this idea that if we just organize and make information accessible, understanding and progress will just naturally follow.
Yeah, that's a great starting point. I mean, this naive view certainly has a strong intuitive appeal. The logic is straightforward. Gather all the facts, make them readily available to everyone, and people will consequently make better decisions, leading to societal advancement. And the dramatic improvement in child survival rates due to the systematic collection and sharing of medical data, like information about blood groups, stands out as a powerful success story for this perspective. It clearly demonstrates how this shared knowledge can have tangible benefits and directly save lives.
Absolutely. That's a really clear example of the positive impact of just open access to information. But then, as you say, we run into a bit of a reality check, don't we? You discuss how the rise of populist movements has really challenged this optimistic viewpoint. Think about figures like Trump and Bolsonaro, or the whole QAnon phenomenon and the anti-vaccine movement. They all, in their own ways, are questioning or outright rejecting the authority of these traditional information sources. You know, the bureaucrats, the doctors, the journalists, the academics.
What's really interesting here is the central argument often put forth by these populist movements. They tend to portray information as a tool or a weapon wielded by elites. These established institutions are seen as spreading misinformation deliberately to maintain their power and privilege at the expense of ordinary people. It's almost a complete inversion of the naive view, where these same institutions were generally regarded as reliable sources of truth.
And it's more than just skepticism, isn't it? It's an outright dismissal of expertise. They're essentially saying, don't believe anything these so-called experts tell you. But then, as you point out, this perspective starts to fall apart when you apply it to the populists themselves. if information is only a weapon used to gain and maintain power, then what about the information they're disseminating?
Right.
Aren't they also potentially just using it for their own ends?
This is where the inherent contradiction lies.
Yeah.
If power is the only driving force,
right,
and information is merely a tool to achieve it, then the populace own pronouncements and narratives are subject to the same critical scrutiny that they apply to others.
Okay.
To try and navigate this logical trap. Some populist movements adopt a radically empiricist stance. They urge people to disregard established authorities and instead do your own research, trusting only what they can directly observe and experience themselves.
The do your own research mantra.
Yeah.
It's become quite a common refrain.
Yeah.
On the surface, it sounds empowering, this idea of individual investigation, but it completely dismisses the necessity of specialized knowledge and the inherent complexity of many issues that simply can't be understood through personal observation alone.
Precisely. It's a tempting notion.
Yeah.
This idea that individuals can bypass established knowledge structures and kind of independently arrive at the truth.
Yeah.
But it fundamentally overlooks the vast amount of accumulated knowledge and the rigorous methodologies that underpin fields like science and journalism.
Right.
And this brings us back to the central idea we touched on earlier.
Okay.
Perhaps our focus has been too heavily on information as a representation of reality.
Right.
And not enough on its crucial role as a connector.
Okay, so let's really delve into this idea of information as connection.
Yeah.
You used the example of music, which I found particularly insightful.
Yeah.
How does that illustrate this point so effectively?
So music serves as a compelling example because it doesn't attempt to represent anything concrete in the real world, so it doesn't really make sense to evaluate like a melody or a rhythm as being true or false.
Okay.
Yet music possesses this incredible power to connect people, to synchronize their emotions and even their physical movements.
Right.
Think about soldiers marching in perfect unison to a specific beat or fans at a sporting event chanting together.
Yeah.
Music creates this shared experience, this network of collective feeling without necessarily conveying any factual information about the world.
Right.
So the key insight here for our understanding of information is that it's this power to connect.
Right.
And it doesn't depend on its accuracy in representing reality.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's about the shared emotional experience, the collective energy.
Right.
It's putting people in formation, as you say.
That's it.
Okay, what about something more fundamental, like DNA? How does that fit into this idea of connection over representation?
So with DNA, the concept of truthfulness is also largely irrelevant.
Okay.
We don't assess whether a lion's DNA has a more accurate portrayal of reality than a zebra's.
Right.
Instead, we evaluate DNA based on the fitness of the organism it produces, its ability to survive and reproduce within its environment.
Yeah.
When we talk about errors in DNA, we're referring to mutations that impair an organism's survival and its ability to connect effectively with its environment. The intricate network of cells within the organism might disintegrate, but it's not a case of the DNA providing like disinformation about the external world. The crucial factor is the maintenance of the network, the functional connection between the constituent parts.
So a breakdown in the DNA network leads to disintegration of the organism, not a misrepresentation of some external truth.
And that's it.
That's a really different and valuable way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
You also bring up the Bible. How can a text that may contain historical inaccuracies still be such a powerful connector?
So the Bible, despite potential discrepancies in its accounts of like human origins or specific historical events, has been remarkably effective in connecting billions of people across vast stretches of time and forming the bedrock of both Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah.
Think of it as a shared set of instructions, this common narrative that binds individuals together into a religious network.
Yeah.
Much like DNA initiates the chemical processes that bind cells together. This religious network then facilitates collective action.
Okay.
The building of institutions, the establishment of traditions, even the waging of wars, things that individuals acting alone could never achieve.
Right.
So while it might not be this flawless representation of historical or cosmological reality, its enduring power lies in this ability to create and sustain these powerful connections between people.
It seems like the essential point here is that while some forms of information certainly aim to represent reality accurately, its most fundamental nature is this ability to connect.
That's it.
And rejecting the naive view doesn't mean we have to abandon the pursuit of truth altogether.
Right.
But it does highlight that simply having more information doesn't automatically lead to a truer understanding of the world without like a deliberate effort to prioritize and critically evaluate that information.
Precisely. And this brings us to the immense power of stories, which are absolutely central to the formation of these large-scale human networks.
Stories, whether they're about our personal experiences, fictional characters, or shared histories, they really do seem to be the fundamental glue that holds societies together. How did the ability to create and share stories give Homo sapiens such a significant advantage over other hominids like the Neanderthals?
So the key difference appears to be in the scale of cooperation. Neanderthals lived in relatively small, isolated bands with limited interaction between groups. Early sapiens, they also lived in small groups. But the development of sophisticated storytelling allowed these bands to connect through shared myths, beliefs about common ancestors, and totemic symbols. These shared narratives created this sense of tribe, a social network connecting hundreds or even thousands of individuals who might never even meet face to face. This unprecedented ability to form larger, more cohesive groups gave sapiens this crucial competitive edge over Neanderthals, enabling more complex forms of cooperation and ultimately greater collective power.
So it wasn't just individual intelligence, but this capacity to construct these shared intersubjective realities through stories that enabled this large-scale cooperation.
Exactly.
That's a really profound insight. And you also point out the positive implication of this, that because history is, in a sense, shaped by these shared stories, we can sometimes resolve conflicts and build peace by changing the narratives we believe in.
Absolutely right. If conflicts were solely based on like tangible material interests and power struggles, then dialogue and negotiation would likely be futile. But because our beliefs, our perceptions, and even our identities are significantly shaped by the stories we tell ourselves and each other, the act of changing those stories, we're creating new shared narratives that foster understanding and empathy can indeed pave the way for peaceful resolutions and increased cooperation.
You draw a fascinating contrast between the U.S. Constitution and the Ten Commandments in this context. How do these two foundational texts illustrate these different approaches to establishing social order and the distinct roles that stories play within them?
The very opening lines are incredibly revealing. The U.S. Constitution begins with this powerful phrase, we the people, explicitly acknowledging its human origin, and by implication suggesting that it can be amended or altered by human agreement. The Ten Commandments, in stark contrast, begin with the declaration, I am the Lord your God, claiming divine origin, which inherently makes them much more resistant to human modification. And this fundamental difference highlights that while all human political and social systems are built upon certain shared beliefs or societal fictions, some openly acknowledge their human construction, making them more adaptable to changing circumstances. While others assert a fixed, often divinely sanctioned authority.
That makes perfect sense. Acknowledging the human origins of our social order inherently opens the door for ongoing change and adaptation. You also use the example of Bialik's poems and their unintended impact on the Arab-Israeli conflict to illustrate just how potent stories can be, even in completely unforeseen ways.
So Bialik's poems, written in Ukraine by someone with a limited direct understanding of the complex situation in Palestine, deeply resonated with the aspirations of many Jewish people for a homeland and a renewed sense of strength following enduring persecution. However, these powerful narratives inadvertently contributed to a perspective that often overlooked the impact on the existing Arab inhabitants of Palestine, as well as the diverse Mizrahi Jewish communities in the Middle East. This somewhat tragic example underscores just how influential stories can be in shaping collective identities and driving historical events, sometimes with unintended and far-reaching, even devastating consequences.
It's a stark reminder that the stories we tell and internalize can have very real and significant effects in the world, even across vast distances of time and geography. Now, shifting gears somewhat, you discuss how the management of increasingly complex societies required a different kind of information beyond these compelling narratives. The rise of bureaucracy and the crucial role of written documents.
As societies grew in size and complexity, with the increasing need to manage resources effectively, collect taxes, and provide various services, narrative information alone simply wasn't sufficient. You can't effectively run a complex tax system or keep track of vast quantities of goods using only poems and myths. This necessity led to the development of what we can call non-narrative information. Things like lists, tax records, inventories, which, while absolutely vital for administration, aren't exactly memorable or emotionally engaging in the same way that stories are. Our brains simply aren't naturally wired to easily recall endless strings of numbers and figures.
No one's going to be sitting around the campfire reciting tax ledgers.
Exactly.
So this need for a different kind of information spurred the invention of written documents as this crucial non-organic information technology.
That's it.
You provide the specific example of Mesopotamian clay tablets used for tracking sheep.
Exactly. These early forms of writing provided a means for the storage and retrieval of vast amounts of practical information that was absolutely essential for managing the affairs of increasingly complex administrations. Just picture that clay tablet from ancient Mesopotamia, meticulously detailing the delivery of hundreds of sheep over a single month. That kind of precise record keeping was fundamental for the royal administration to monitor resources, ensure accountability, and maintain order within the kingdom.
But bureaucracy, while undeniably necessary for managing complex societies, isn't without its inherent drawbacks, is it?
That's right.
You discuss some of the distortions it can introduce, even within an institution like academia, where departments, like history, biology, and mathematics might study a holistic event like the COVID-19 pandemic in relative isolation. This division of knowledge into separate bureaucratic silos, while potentially creating efficiencies in specific areas of research, can also lead to a fragmented and incomplete understanding of reality. COVID-19, as you mentioned.
Was this historical event deeply influenced by biological factors and analyzed through these complex mathematical models, yet the structure of academic bureaucracy often encourages specialization within individual departments and can sometimes discourage the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration needed for a truly comprehensive and holistic understanding of such multifaceted events.
It's like each department is looking at a different part of the elephant and mistakenly believing they have grasped the entirety of the creature.
Exactly.
And this rise of bureaucracy and the increasing reliance on written documents also led to a significant shift in authority and power, didn't it?
Absolutely. As written documents became the crucial links in many social and administrative chains, power naturally gravitated towards those who possessed the skills to understand, interpret, and manipulate them. The administrators, the accountants, the legal experts who mastered the often arcane logic of bureaucratic systems. Within these systems, the ability to navigate obscure regulations and the labyrinthine processes of committees can often become a significant source of power in itself. Sometimes even more so than a deep understanding of the underlying issues.
So it's not always about having the most profound understanding of the subject matter, but rather about knowing the rules of the bureaucratic game and how to effectively play them.
That's it.
Now, shifting our focus somewhat, you delve into the idea of biological dramas and how the fundamental concepts of purity and impurity act as powerful underlying themes in many of our stories and even in the very structure of our societies.
Think about the core plot lines of many ancient myths and folktales, like the Ramayana, with its themes of parental favoritism, banishment, and the struggle for succession. These narratives resonate so deeply across cultures and time because they tap into these fundamental biological dramas rooted in our evolutionary history as mammals and birds.
Right.
All offspring are inherently dependent on parental care and experience this primal fear of neglect or abandonment.
Yeah.
This deep-seated biological imperative, this need for connection and the fear of separation becomes this template for countless human stories, from simple fairy tales to complex national myths and even profound religious concepts, where something like hell is often conceived as this state of utter separation from a divine parent figure.
That connection between our most basic biological needs and these grand overarching narratives is truly fascinating.
Yeah.
And you then discuss how this fundamental concept of purity versus impurity has been frequently exploited to create divisive us versus them narratives throughout history.
Unfortunately, the seemingly simple binary of purity and impurity has proven to be this incredibly potent tool for creating social divisions and justifying discrimination. It's frequently used to demonize and marginalize specific groups by associating them with disease, pollution, or some inherent form of impurity, whether it's based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or even entire ethnic or religious groups. The horrific Rwandan genocide, where Tutsis were dehumanizingly referred to as cockroaches, and Nazi Germany's portrayal of Jewish people as vermin like rats, are extreme and terrifying examples of how this kind of dehumanizing rhetoric rooted in these feelings of disgust and notions of impurity can lead to unimaginable levels of violence and atrocity.
Those are indeed chilling examples of how these deeply ingrained biological responses can be manipulated on this mass scale to justify the most terrible acts.
Absolutely.
And you also detail the Hindu caste system as a complex and enduring social structure that is fundamentally built upon these supposed levels of purity.
The Hindu caste system serves as a stark and enduring example of how this concept of purity and impurity can be deeply institutionalized into this rigid social hierarchy, dictating virtually every aspect of an individual's life, from their profession and social interactions to who they can marry and even their physical proximity to members of other castes. It's this deeply ingrained intersubjective system based on these perceived levels of ritual purity with profound and often devastating real-world consequences for those deemed impure or untouchable.
It's a powerful illustration of how these seemingly abstract ideas can shape concrete social realities and perpetuate inequality over centuries. Now, considering the immense power of these information networks, both the mythological and the bureaucratic, you raise this critical question about their relationship with truth. You point out that throughout history, rebel groups have frequently targeted archives. Why is that such a recurring pattern?
Rebel movements throughout history, from the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome to the French Revolution, intuitively understood that archives represented the very backbone of the established bureaucratic machine. By strategically destroying these essential documents, you know, the records of debts, land ownership, legal precedents, and administrative procedures. They aim to fundamentally disrupt the existing social order. And undermine the legitimacy of the ruling powers in the eyes of the populace. Even if the rebels themselves were largely illiterate, they recognized that without these crucial records, the systems of control, taxation, and obligation couldn't effectively function.
So it was a direct and calculated attack on the infrastructure of order itself.
Exactly.
And this leads to this crucial idea that these dominant information networks, both bureaucracy with its rules and regulations and mythology with its shared beliefs and social cohesion, primarily prioritize the maintenance of order, perhaps even at the expense of truth.
Exactly. Both bureaucracy, with its inherent focus on established rules, procedures and precedents, and mythology, with its emphasis on reinforcing shared beliefs, cultural norms, and social cohesion, are fundamentally concerned with ensuring stability and preventing societal breakdown. Truth, while sometimes aligning with the maintenance of order, can also be inherently disruptive and pose a significant challenge to established systems and deeply held beliefs. This then raises a critical question for any information network.
Right.
What internal mechanisms exist to prevent these systems from completely losing touch with reality?
Right.
How do they identify and correct their own errors, even if doing so might cause some temporary instability or challenge these deeply ingrained narratives?
That's a really vital question.
Yeah.
And you suggest that the invention and widespread adoption of holy books might represent one such significant mechanism.
Okay.
Tell us more about that.
So holy books, such as the Bible and the Quran, emerged as this novel kind of information technology intended to serve as a comprehensive and ideally error-free repository of essential societal knowledge, encompassing moral codes, historical narratives, and cosmological explanations. The underlying idea was to create this definitive and authoritative source of truth, supposedly free from the inherent fallibility of human institutions and individual biases. However, the claim that these books are absolutely impervious to error or interpretation has its limitations, as the historical context surrounding their canonization and the ongoing debates about their meaning clearly reveal.
You specifically address this common misconception about the Dead Sea Scrolls being the oldest complete version of the Bible. What did those remarkable scrolls actually reveal about the formation of the biblical texts?
The Dead Sea Scrolls, this fascinating collection of diverse Jewish documents dating from around the last 2 centuries BCE, actually provide compelling evidence that there wasn't this single universally recognized Bible at that time within Judaism. While some of the scrolls contain texts that later became part of the Hebrew Bible, Christians call the Old Testament. Many others include books and fragments that were eventually excluded from the canonical texts, such as the Book of Enoch, which held significant religious importance for the community at Qumran that produced the scrolls. This demonstrates that the very idea of a fixed and universally accepted biblical canon evolved gradually over time. It wasn't this singular ancient entity handed down in its complete form.
So the Bible as we know it today is in fact the product of this.